Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first Ancient Warfare Magazine combined video audio podcast. Today, with me, as always, are Michael Taylor, and then there's Lindsay Powell,
Hello.
and there's Joshua Brouwers. Hi, guys.
Hello.
We've also got a slightly different style of introduction for you today. So, for those of you who are not completely up to date with Pyrrhus of Epirus, let's have a look.
Ancient Warfare Magazine, Volume 6, Issue 4. Out of Alexander's Shadow, The Campaigns of Pyrrhus of Epirus. Pyrrhus was the second cousin to Alexander the Great, and at only 2 years he began his career as a penniless exile after his father was dethroned. Pyrrhus would rise to become King of Epirus, King of Macedon, and King of Sicily. Then, during street fighting in the city of Argos, he would meet his demise when an old woman stunned him with a tile thrown from a roof, and he was overpowered and beheaded. Unlike Alexander, Pyrrhus turned his eyes to the west. In 306 BC, aged 12, his throne was restored to him. Ruling as a minor, he was deposed after just 4 years. In the next few years, he served as an officer during the turbulent wars of the Diadochi as Alexander the Great's successors vied for power. See Ancient Warfare, Volume 3, Issue 2. After marrying Ptolemy of Egypt's daughter, he was once more returned to his throne in 297 BC, for a short time ruling jointly with his second cousin Neoptolemus, before having him killed 2 years later. Exploiting a dynastic quarrel in Macedonia, he gained more frontier territory before attacking his brother-in-law Demetrius I of Macedon, briefly taking control of the kingdom before being driven out by Demetrius's successor Lysimachus in 284 BC. In 281 BC, the Greek city Tarentum in the south of Italy came under threat from the emerging power of Rome. No one in Italy had yet managed to stand up to the new, rising state. Coming to their aid, Pyrrhus stopped them at Heraclea and marched to within sight of Rome, though the Romans refused to negotiate. The next summer he beat them at Asculum, though the victory was costly for him. Now Syracuse begged for help to drive out Carthage, and with 10,000 men Pyrrhus lifted the siege on the city and was proclaimed king of Sicily. With the exception of Lilybaeum and Messana, he controlled the whole of the island. He would need another 200 ships to make an attempt to capture the two cities, but his allies were reluctant to supply men and material. All his demanding and cajoling only increased his unpopularity, with a number of cities defecting. In the meantime, Rome had rebuilt her army, calling up thousands of fresh recruits, and was once more threatening Tarentum. Pyrrhus returned to Italy in 276. Moving to meet the new threat, he was outnumbered and his army war-weary. In the ensuing battle of Beneventum, he lost thousands dead and captured. Pyrrhus now decided to end his campaigning in Italy, returning to Epirus, effectively ending the war with Rome and resulting in the loss of all his holdings on the peninsula. With borrowed money from Egypt, he raised more men and invaded Macedon, persuading many Macedonians to desert and join him, subsequently capturing most of Thessaly and Macedon. He next made a foray into Sparta. Under the guise of placing Cleonymus on the throne there, Pyrrhus could then seize control of the Peloponnese. Though most of their military might was campaigning in Crete, the Spartans held out against the assault. When he failed to win the city, Pyrrhus gave up the siege and turned his army to attack Argos. It was during street-to-street fighting that Pyrrhus was killed. As Paul MacDonald Staff points out, it is easy to dismiss him as an adventurer or even mercenary general, yet arguably it was simply that Pyrrhus, despite his military talents, did not have that stroke of good fortune that put Alexander in the right place at the right time. Highly regarded for his military acumen in the ancient world, he is the topic of one of Plutarch's lives, where, reportedly, Hannibal declares that the foremost of all generals in experience and ability was Pyrrhus. In a packed issue, Nicholas Secunda looks at the written sources we have for Pyrrhus. Michael Taylor explores the rise of the Roman army at the time. Richard Evers investigates how Epirus, a relative backwater, managed to subdue half of Italy, Sicily and most of Greece and Macedon under Pyrrhus. Sidney Dean recounts the campaigns in Sicily, while Joseph Pietrzykowski relates the Battle of Heraclea, where the Roman legions clashed with the Macedonian phalanx for the first time. Though a victory for Pyrrhus, his casualties were irreplaceable, leading Plutarch to quote a report by Dionysius stating, "One more such victory would utterly undo him." And so the phrase "a Pyrrhic victory" was born.
And there we go, from Pyrrhic victory to, I guess, Pyrrhus' reputation, because it's kind of interesting to note that he had, as we've seen in the introduction of the magazine, a pretty stellar reputation in the ancient world, but he is not considered as much of an important general nowadays. Michael, can you think of any reasons for that?
Some of it must just, I think, simply be the ancients had kind of different objectives when it came to evaluating generals. I mean, we might be very kind of outcome oriented and say, well, look, in the end, despite some brilliant victories or brilliant moments on the field, Pyrrhus basically fails at everything he tries to do. He tries to become the king of Macedonia. He succeeds for a few brief moments, but then pulls back. He tries to establish some kind of control over southern Italy. He fails. He tries to establish some sort of control over Sicily, or at least fight the Carthaginians. He ultimately withdraws and sort of leaves the Greeks in the east to their fate. So he's it seems to us as sort of an outcome-driven evaluation, there's this kind of total failure, and he's someone who seems completely unfocused. I think we were joking earlier that it seems like he has the Hellenistic general equivalent of ADD. He just goes from kind of one campaign to another without actually following through and having any kind of political outcome. But it may be that the ancients were evaluating by an entirely separate set of criteria, and that what mattered more was his character, his complete devotion to the art of war. There's the famous sort of anecdote where he supposedly is at a party and somebody says, don't you think so-and-so is a great flute player? And he says, oh, that doesn't matter at all. All that matters is that, Polyperchon is a great general. So that kind of focus, that those stellar sort of tactical moments may be what the ancients just chose to remember him for, rather than for accomplishing anything, or even having leaving a long and successful dynasty behind him.
And isn't there another aspect to this, which is ultimately the victors write the history? It has to be that in the case of the books that we do have, for example, Caesar's Gallic War, for example, clearly that survived because his overwhelming stature is so great that it kind of propels his name through history. Pyrrhus, of course, has a negative connotation, I think, as we discussed earlier. People don't, generally speaking, write about losers, and unfortunately, even if he was a great strategist and wrote books which people, even at Hannibal, tended to admire, they haven't survived, and in part possibly because the Romans decided it wasn't going to survive.
It also might sound, the way you explain it at least, Michael, that Pyrrhus may have been a very good battlefield general, or at least personally very brave, in that way very much like Alexander, perhaps not as careful with his troops as some, but perhaps he was a bad politician.
Yeah, he seems to be. I mean, he and I think he is remembered, at least the very positive views that survive in the ancient sources, and he's lucky that while many of the initial sources around him don't survive, and his own tactical writings only survive in the shortest of fragments, he has a pretty good publicist in the form of Plutarch, whose biography is really why we know Pyrrhus, and at least really defines the modern view of Pyrrhus. But it doesn't seem that anyone really is evaluating him on necessarily ability to establish a larger Western empire successfully, and leave a long-standing dynasty to tell the tale. It seems to be more his sort of brilliant moments on the battlefield and his stellar character that seem to matter to the ancients when they evaluate him so favorably.
I think it's correct that politically speaking, he wasn't very strong. In Sicily, he didn't manage to. He was proclaimed king of Sicily and then later more or less kicked out. So he wasn't very. He had a difficulty, I guess, relating to people in some particular fashion. Okay, when it came to killing them, but not so much when dealing with them while still alive, I guess.
Yeah, we do have the story that the Tarentines invite Pyrrhus to come, and they say, we really need your help. These Romans are very, very frightening, and we'd like you to deal with them. And he comes and immediately declares martial law in Tarentum, and drafts the entire male population into his army and bans drinking parties and flute playing because these make men soft. And the result is the Tarentines, after a while, just they say, well. We're now between a rock and a hard place. We didn't think this Pyrrhus guy would cause us so many problems. So that seems to be a kind of example of his political obtuseness, that he kind of alienates what could have been a very important ally relatively early on in his Italian adventure.
Okay, might you suggest that because Pyrrhus is initially at least successful at getting lots of allies who give him troops and supplies and whatever he needs, but then because of his slight problem with having Pyrrhic victories, that at some point the allies go, hang on, this is costing us too many of our male citizens, probably of our warriors. Is there any indication of war weariness going on? Something that we would, recognize today as, too many caskets coming home, and the local population or the body politic going, this is not sustainable. We have to rein this guy in, and Pyrrhus is completely blind to this problem.
Yeah, we certainly have the problem that we actually don't know when we know that the Lucanians and many other kind of southern Italian people, Samnites, whatnot, actually send troops. And this is, of course, in part that Pyrrhus arrives at a pretty good moment if you want to recruit ferocious southern Italian warriors into your army, because all of these peoples are very unhappy with the sort of rising hegemony of Rome. We don't, unfortunately, all the accounts that we have, I don't think give us a great sense of, are these guys getting tired? At Maleventum, his last big hurrah against Rome, he does have a very sizable contingent of various sort of South Italian peoples. So they at least are willing to flock to him for one last shot in 275.
What sort of number of troops was he able to raise? And were we talking tens of thousands or even
tens of thousands? There's introduction lists pretty extensively how many troops he manages to collect every time.
And of course, there's a certain issue of source criticism. It seems that the numbers that we get for his initial invasion, about 20,000 heavy infantry, 3,000 peltasts, a certain number of light troops, those figures seem to come from Hieronymus of Cardia, who is the best historian that we have nothing of, and those are probably pretty accurate. Some of the other accounts, for example, supposedly has 70,000 people at Asculum, but I think that comes from Dionysius of Halicarnassus, a late Republican antiquarian who's probably using some less than reliable analytic sources, and huge numbers of troops. But certainly his army, for the most part, was probably 30 to 40,000. I think that would be at least a correct order of magnitude, and the Romans seem to be fielding armies of similar sizes. Which
is interesting, because that you get similarly sized troops, very different tactics. This brings us very easily, of course, to the fact that Pyrrhus and Rome is the first time two different tactical systems meet, and apparently at more or less equal numbers, it's very difficult for either side to get the upper hand.
Yeah, although Pyrrhus tends to get the upper hand more often than not against the Romans. Certainly, for the kind of grand tactical question of legion v phalanx. This is interesting. It is the first confrontation. That being said, we do have some problems. We don't actually know exactly what the Roman legion looks like at this point. There's pretty good evidence that the Romans have at this point evolved to the kind of tres acies. They do have the 3 lines of hastati, principes, triarii. They do seem to be fighting in maniples. They are using the kind of oblong shield sword combination that will define the Roman tactical system into the Republic. Some debate about whether the legion is still a little more phalangeal in terms of the kind of spears that the second line, the principes, are using. But the interesting thing is that it seems that Pyrrhus modifies his own Macedonian-style tactical system to look a little more manipular, and that as he gets these units of southern Italian troops, Samnites, Lucanians, whatnot, he supposedly puts them in units in between the sort of divisions of his phalanx, and actually tries to make his phalanx, I guess, a little more again manipular, or involves these Italian troops. And there is some evidence that the Romans may either be a little more phalangeal, or may actually start using cavalry spears to kind of look a little more like a Macedonian phalanx. At least this is a brief notice we get in the Battle of Ascalon, that the principes are carrying cavalry spears instead of javelins. So, interesting enough, these 2 distinct tactical systems meet, and it's quite possible that they both kind of copy each other a little bit in order to deal with the difference.
I'm intrigued to understand why Hannibal thought he was such a great general then. I mean, with all this that we know, as an extension of what we opened our discussion about was the sort of characteristics of his leadership style. Hannibal is revered by a lot of people because he was able to challenge Rome, and clearly he seemed to have actually got the upper hand on more occasions, it sounds like, than Pyrrhus. And yet he liked Pyrrhus. So what did he do that he liked so much?
I mean, on one hand, this is a problematic anecdote, because supposedly Hannibal's talking with the guy who defeated him, Scipio Africanus, and Scipio kind of would like Hannibal to say, Scipio, you're the greatest general ever, or at best you're second to Alexander. And Hannibal's is thinking about greatest generals, says, well, the greatest is Alexander, second greatest is Pyrrhus, and then I'm number 3. And Scipio is a little offended by this. And wait a second, that I beat you. And supposedly Hannibal comes back with a kind of flattering response where he says, well, if you'd beaten me, you would have been greater than all 3 of those guys combined. But yeah, it is interesting that Pyrrhus is routinely up there with Alexander. And again, the date of that anecdote is hard to tell. It's hard to tell if it's even historical. It's unclear when Scipio Africanus would have actually been talking with Hannibal at any given time. But it certainly does indicate that the ancients, in their perception of good generalship, lumped Pyrrhus right up there with Alexander the Great and Hannibal as one of the quintessential great generals.
Yeah, and continues to impress people. I mean, there are numerous programs and books. There was recently one which was written by a well-known historian who took Caesar, Alexander the Great, and Hannibal. And I don't believe Pyrrhus is mentioned, maybe apart from in a footnote. So I think Pyrrhus probably deserves to have his day in the sun, and this issue of the magazine certainly goes some way to doing that.
In Plutarch's Parallel Lives, who is Pyrrhus paired up with?
I don't know that he is. In my copy, he's between the comparison of Philopoemen with Flaminius, then there's Pyrrhus, and then there's Caius Marius. So it sounds like he's one of those characters who's actually standalone.
Okay.
No, I think he is paired with Marius. I think it's
Marius.
Pyrrhus and Marius, yeah.
It's an interesting pairing.
Yeah, well, in the copy I've got, which is this massive book, I don't believe it is paired. I mean, we go straight into, we are altogether ignorant of any third name of Caius Marius, also of Quintus Sertorius, and it's completely disconnected from the Pyrrhus piece.
The Comparanda does not survive, but I think they are. I think it is Pyrrhus and Marius. He's not, because the standalone biographies are Artaxerxes, Aratus, Galba, and Otho. So I think there is a. I think we've lost the Comparanda, but
Because Pyrrhus typically isn't regarded as a great reformer. I mean, we talked about the changes he did to the phalanx system by introducing more manipular systems. probably to better articulate the phalanx, I guess.
Yeah, we get this report actually in Polybius, who's a big fan of the sort of manipular legion, and he reports that Pyrrhus thinks that the phalanx is just too clunky as a single mass of infantry, and that he does break it up and make it more maneuverable by putting a kind of a maniple in between. It's unclear exactly what division of the phalanx Polybius is talking about, but yeah, I mean, it certainly isn't exactly copying the legion. He's not using a 3 battle lines, which Hannibal actually eventually will, but he does seem to be breaking it up, mixing Italian infantry armed with ovular shields and javelins with his heavily armed Macedonian pikemen armed with sarissai.
So maybe that's the reason why Plutarch would pair him up with Marius, because both of them reformed the existing system to be more flexible.
You can also,
I guess.
Could you chalk it up to being in the end unsuccessful?
Marius has left a greater impression on the Roman army, I think, than Pyrrhus probably had on the Hellenistic army. So, not really unsuccessful as such.
And, well, of course, Marius lost out in the civil war in the end. I mean, there is no political happy ending to Marius's life.
No. Just like Pyrrhus, then.
Yeah, and as a general rule, Plutarch is a little more hesitant about the nature of big Hellenistic figures, and they tend to get them compared with more dubious Roman figures. I mean, it's a classical figure. He will, compare it to someone who's really terrific. I mean, Pericles gets paired with Fabius Maximus, but once you get a Hellenistic general like Pyrrhus, he's going to probably get paired with some Roman warlord whose reputation's not altogether savory.
On the other hand, it is Marius, who is associated with Caesar. It's probably not just it's not just it's not somebody, just nobody. It's definitely a somebody.
And the things we're missing, of course, is we don't have the library of books of tactics that he wrote, and I would imagine that Plutarch did, and certainly all the other generals must have had access to it. So his real brilliance and insight is lost to us. I think what Michael was telling us earlier is that all we have is these snippets or allusions to things that he apparently said.
Yeah, it's mostly allusions to snippets,
which is quite depressing, isn't it? Because it's 2 or 3 years away.
Well, that we've talked about that before. I think that the estimates are that about 5 to 10% maybe survives of all written records.
And not just written records, also the archaeological evidence.
Yeah, it's just maybe it's the archaeological evidence, and then maybe only part of that is the actual written evidence. I mean, if you go down to statistical data of what should be available on the Roman army and what actually does survive, it's minimal.
Well, and one of the interesting things is that, ironically, I guess we can call them winners or not, but the Romans are completely silent. They do not have a historical tradition at this point. The earliest Roman history is going to be around 200 BC. So even when the Romans, later Romans try to invent what happened when Pyrrhus invaded, they're either using other Hellenistic sources or they're making it up. So we really actually don't have a great view of the Roman side of the story beyond the consular lists and what the Romans put on their coins that they minted at the time.
Yeah, some is there any annalistic tradition at this time? I think so. No.
They may have some of the records that some of the annalists would have used, and again, it's unclear what those would have looked like. But definitely, no Roman is sitting down and writing a history of
there's no
what Pyrrhus
narrative,
did, yet last year. So there does seem to be some folk tradition. There is the tradition that Pyrrhus's elephants were charging around, and they ran into some Roman pigs, and the elephants were terrified by these Roman pigs and fled, and that does seem to tie in with the As Signatum that we have that has an elephant on one side and a pig on the other, that does date from the time of the Pyrrhic Wars.
Very important open. Yes, if you have to, it's very important.
Most reliable stuff we have is anything that we think was actually written by a Greek or Hellenistic historian who's a contemporary. And it would be nice to have Pyrrhus's Tactica. That we could actually see what was going on in that supposedly very keen military mind.
Well, we could turn it back around as well. I mean, we said he has a wonderful reputation in the ancient world, and yet, if you look at it, how many brilliant victories did he really win? There's a reason we know the word Pyrrhic victory. It's none of them apparently sufficient to bring the Romans to their knees. And of course, Hannibal learned half a century later that there's really nothing that will bring Rome to its knees at that point, anyway. But brilliant victories at very high cost to his own army. So what was that? Is that because he lost track of what the best way was to defeat Rome? Was it too hard to adapt to the way of Roman fighting? Was there?
Well, apparently his words after the Battle of Asculum were, "One more such victory will undo me."
Yeah.
And being transliterated into that victory. It sounds like a very sober assessment from someone who knows his own shortcomings. So perhaps one of his virtues was that he understood what he was capable of, but just kept on going beyond
But
it.
Hannibal, of course, had a disadvantage in that he wasn't an autocratic ruler. He had the Senate in Carthage to placate, and that threw up all sorts of problems as well. Pyrrhus didn't have those problems because he was the sole ruler, and still he managed to mess things up, basically.
I keep getting these terrible images that sort of like Germany in the late 40s, in 1945, so where Hitler kept on meddling. He was in the same position as Pyrrhus, wasn't he? He could rally all the forces he thought he could get, and he didn't win too many battles either. It's sort of this sort of megalomania takes over, a sense of invincibility. I'll just get more men. It's easy enough. My allies will provide. And that's why I asked the question earlier about the numbers. I mean, these are massive numbers of troops that you've got to keep replenishing. So no wonder he says, "One more such victory will undo me." He realizes by that point that he's running out of resources.
And he does seem to have the problem that the core of his army, trained as a Macedonian-style phalanx of heavy infantry and Macedonian Hellenistic-style cavalry, is ultimately much more modest than the armies he can raise by supplementing with Samnite warriors. And Epirus is it's never been a big player. This is he's managed to raise a small, well-disciplined kind of professional-style Hellenistic army, but it does mean that every one of his well-trained, disciplined soldiers from Molossia or the Epirot League that dies, he doesn't really have a replacement, and there may not be a sort of one-to-one equivalency of loses one of the crack soldiers he comes over with. It may not be. You just can't take a Samnite warrior and have that expect that guy to be as effective. So it may be one of his issues is the dwindling size of his core army that does seem to get smaller and smaller and smaller until I think when he comes to Rome the second time he has 8,000 troops, probably less than 10,000 altogether. So that may be the biggest constraint, the sort of core Hellenistic style force that he has, even though he can at any time seem to raise up temporary levies of South Italian allies.
Is one of his shortcomings his inability to get the Hellenistic, the Greek-speaking world to sort of band together and actually fight as one against what ultimately will become a common foe? It seems the Romans are slightly more adept at leveraging their treaty alliance and are able to sort of lock them into this idea. So what went wrong there, perhaps?
Well, Pyrrhus does have one big ally. It's Ptolemy II Philadelphus of Egypt, and that's a pretty good ally to have. He's got a ton of money. Supposedly he even actually lends some troops to Pyrrhus to kind of kickstart his army. He's the kickstarter of Pyrrhus's whole campaigns. At the same time, the reason that Ptolemy really wants to support Pyrrhus is as a bulwark against what will eventually become the Macedonia, whether it's controlled by Lysimachus or Antigonus II. And it seems that after a while, Ptolemy loses interest in Pyrrhus and kind of decides that, well, this really just isn't my guy. And that probably is ultimately a very bad thing for Pyrrhus and reduces the ambition that he can actually have in the West. because he probably is reliant at this point on a much bigger power, Ptolemaic Egypt, for money and even men, which Epirus just doesn't have that much of either.
So is it in a sense a proxy war that the Egyptians are paying for? So they stand the cost, but they don't stand the losses. They stand the losses in treasure, but not in blood. If I could put it that way.
Yeah, I mean, well, the Ptolemies are very good at kind of trying to contain Macedonia by supporting others who are not friendly with Macedonia. It'll eventually, the Ptolemies will later bankroll Athens and Sparta against Antigonus. So at the same time, Ptolemy seems to have really nothing against Rome. And the interesting thing is, after he kind of lets Pyrrhus go and just kind of cuts off support, he is the first major Hellenistic king to establish diplomatic relations with Rome. So he actually sort of seems to say, these guys have, maybe they are actually kind of important to establish relations with, so that's the opening of kind of diplomatic contacts with Rome and really any power, it seems, in the Hellenistic East.
Play everybody.
So yeah, I mean, the Ptolemy II is a pretty canny guy. He's not being ideological about this at all.
Well, that's what real world politics requires: a practical vision and a means to make that come about. It would seem to be that Pyrrhus didn't have that.
Well, on this note of realpolitik and Pyrrhus in the context of the Hellenistic world, it's probably time to put this issue to bed for a while and come back in a little bit with another podcast about the first issue of Ancient Warfare magazine that Joshua edited all by himself. And that will be Diocletian. We just jump forward another 5 centuries or so. But until that time, it's goodbye to Michael, Lindsay, and Joshua. Speak to you soon.